Partnerships and Development team, and I have with me our esteemed Centre for Fashion curators. I have Judith Clark, who's an exhibition maker.
I am.
And Alison Maloney, whose project this was. And then I have Amy Delahaye as well, a curator at our centre here. And I'll let them all introduce themselves separately quickly.
Hello, I'm Judith Clark, as Ellie just said, and my official title here is Professor of Fashion and Museology at UAL. And with Amy, we run the Centre for Fashion Curation and run the Master's course in Fashion Curation.
Hi, I'm Alison Maloney. I'm a curator here and a research fellow, and my remit is to develop an international exhibitions programme.
Hello, I'm Amy. I'm Professor of Dress History and Curatorship at the College of Fashion, and as well as running the MA with Judith, we also teach a number of PhD students. And my work is mainly led by working with objects and exhibitions and writing.
Hi, you're speaking to us at the oldest campus of UCT. So this is the original kind of buildings. Have any of you been to Cape Town?
No,
I have.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we hope this is the start of great things. All our students here form part of our postgraduate program in curation. The Centre for Curating the Archive thinks about, takes the notion of archive and curation in all its complexities and problematics, I would imagine, particularly here in South Africa. And we're at a moment in South Africa where all kinds of questions around who we are, you know, what this rainbow nation is supposed to be, has really come to the fore. And I was invited to speak at London College of Fashion in July, and I came away absolutely struck by the possibilities around what it means to represent oneself in terms of fashion. And the kind of scholarship around that is really in its infancy in South Africa. Our panelists here, I mean, Malibongwe and Pat, will really speak a little bit more about trends and so forth. But what we have failed to do is really initiate those questions of what it means to think about a decoloniality or questions of freedom and self-representation through fashion, particularly in this post-apartheid, well, we're not quite post-apartheid, but particularly in this moment. So we are interested in those kinds of questions, fascinated by your films, which we've watched, and like to think about and hear your comments on what Africa, and I hate to use the word Africa because it is so broad, so let's just bring it really down to the local. What a place like South Africa with our particular histories can offer or should offer in terms of curation and archive and bodies and fashion. So over to the experts. Sorry, you're confused.
So would you like to, sorry Sheena, would you like to hear a little bit more about the question? Is that a question you're asking us more specifically rather than something you've just seen on the film, or, you know, would you like to open it up to a broader context in that sense?
Well, I think it comes out of watching these films.
Okay.
It's in response to that, you know, these are beautifully created and curated works of art. And the question came up, well, how does that speak to us in South Africa? What can we bring to this conversation around fashion? Because questions like 1914 for us has we clearly know what's happening in 1914, 1918, the World War and so forth. But for us, 1914 follows a key year of 1913 in South Africa, which is the Land Act, and which sets up apartheid. You know, so when we, you know, it's just literally a different lane. So when we say 1914, and when we watching movies, we see a Europe unfolding. We think 1914, and we think about the ramifications of what that time meant, and of what we still feel today. So we are hoping that these kinds of initiatives can bridge those gaps. You know, so that we can start looking at 1914 through your work, and hopefully our kinds of conversations can shape another way of thinking about 1914 in other ways. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if I give a little bit of context to the project, it actually, the inspiration behind 1914 Now came out of the Venice Architecture Biennale, and I've long been fascinated by both the art and the architecture biennales in the sense that it has multiple perspectives on the same brief. So from the sense that this was our response, we're not obviously a country we didn't have a pavilion, but it was our response, and in the context of the Biennale, watching these films, the audience can see that there are these different multiple perspectives from these different countries. So that's where the impetus for the project came from.
I know it's cheeky to answer a question with a question, but I wonder if you gave us what your immediate, perhaps knee-jerk responses to the films were, then perhaps we can respond to that, because I think I can't imagine how you feel watching them, so it's actually quite difficult to respond.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I think it's about creating one's own idiom, though. I mean, when Alison asked us to participate in this project, it was very much on our own terms, and something that you inevitably will kind of extrapolate from it, as in it was about taking a date that, of course, is not random within, you know, the history of the world, in the sense that it's a very striking date that obviously has a kind of immediate association, but then there are personal associations. So for me, it might have been one aspect of, let's say, dress history, for Amy another, etc., in the sense that it also was very much not a group perspective, but a very individualized one, not only in terms of a response to the date, but in terms of the kind of conversations that were sparked. So it was like a kind of free association, if you like, as you so rightly said. In terms of yours, it may have been a year that was an aftermath to 1913, etc. You know, that we have our milestones from which we create our positions.
But our curatorial position wouldn't have been that different if it had been another year. So we might have chosen another object or another movement. But I mean, I think my response would have been, it wouldn't have been dissimilar. It might have been with another garment. But the curatorial attitude remains the same irrespective of the year.
Responses to the documentary, to the different pieces.
I think Catherine has a question for you.
Well, hi, I'll introduce myself. My name is Catherine Mary Pichelik, and I own a jewelry brand in South Africa called Pichelik. And I reimagine materials in a kind of collage, in a collage way. Predominantly working with rope and textiles, and we really kind of draw inspirations from South Africa, but also across continental Africa. So it really has that feeling, and yeah, so I export and whatever. But what kind of came up in our discussions today was, what right do I have as a white woman to represent Africa in the designs that I create? And I think what becomes quite interesting is what makes you African, what gives you your identity in a performative way, and what, you know, is your representation that's associated, and who's allowed and not allowed, almost the democracy and the politics around fashion. And I think also what becomes kind of specific to South Africa is, you know, we had sanctions during the 1970s, so we couldn't import international brands, so things like from even sushi or like, you know, a cappuccino only landed in like the early 2000s in South Africa, and even that kind of also resounds with different fashion brands. So in a way, like we've been very separate to the world, and for us to kind of renegotiate being part of a global dialogue around fashion becomes our greatest challenge. And how to export our products, how to become relevant in that discourse, because often we are kind of considered just ethnographical, and not necessarily having a contemporary voice that kind of relates to international fashion trends. And I think what I got from your... Hello?
No, I don't think that's our perception, because there's lots of things happening in the UK about Africa at the moment. And I mean, I just know I live on the South Coast, and at Brighton Museum there's a big exhibition about to open called African Fashion Cities, and it's all about 4 big fashion cities in Africa showcasing local designers' work. So I think we're aware of African fashion.
But I think also sometimes the way, what versions of African fashion that you get to see is quite filtered and quite specific of the avenues in which you receive them. Because I think, like, maybe on a larger scale, but if you're talking about your kind of micro businesses, and there's not giving you as much scope per se, and maybe kind of support to really cultivate that industry, because we're starting to get all these bigger monopolies like H&M, we've got Zara, and it's kind of like this kind of conflict in a way of trying to cultivate these smaller industries, micro businesses around fashion that are kind of being overrun by these larger companies. I don't know if that makes sense. So what I wanted to just respond to was just the democracy of fashion and representation and identity, specifically being African and being white, and what does it mean from our side? Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. My name is Malibongo. I work primarily as a fashion journalist. So one of the things is like a huge concern of mine personally. Catherine spoke about the sanctions for the longest time. So our fashion as an industry is fairly quite young, especially from a design perspective. But the conversation around curation, around creating a sort of institutionalized memory is coming up more and more and more often. I don't know if you know about the Zeitz Museum, the Museum of Contemporary African Art, the one it's been built in Cape Town, the building's been done by Thomas Heatherwick. It's a whole big deal. So they also opening a costume institute. And with the opening of the costume institute, now you have to now be selecting people and be curating fashion exhibitions. And just my main thing, especially like concerning the way you've done it and the way you've responded to it in film, and the fact that you work around fashion curation, is just I'm curious about how that process has worked for you. Obviously, I think you have a longer span, much longer time to look back to in order to work out where you are. And as we, in terms of archive, like a much bigger archive, and we're looking at an archive that's about only 20 years really. And there's a couple of people that designed during like the 70s and 60s, but they never made it into a huge thing. I don't know if like there's a question in that, but this is some of the things that watching the films makes me think about. I'm trying to think about how then do we, on our side, are we looking? Is it too soon to be trying to create these archives, or what kind of archives are appropriate for a fashion history that is so young?
I mean, fashion history is never going to be young for any community, because it goes back all the way for everybody in terms of its basics. I think what happens and what is happening here exponentially is that theoretical positions are being articulated within the museum in a very different way, and in a much more explicit way. But I don't think that's to do with the age of the archive. It's to do with the kind of attitude towards its use and its documentation. And I think we're all coming to grips with the same thing, that an index is not really an index, that it's not set in stone, and that it's all necessarily kind of subjective. And I think that we're all doing in tandem, in the sense that anyone's take on it is as valid as the next man's. And so I think it took a long time for fashion to be accepted within the museum here, as you know. And so I think we all feel that in many ways this is still a kind of young and vibrant area, because it was a latecomer, relatively speaking, within the museum.
Does that answer your question a little, Malibongo?
No, it's I agree. I see. It also, I like what you say, because it also brings up a different point in terms of looking at it as young and not so young. It's also because the way I was looking at it was very much within an industry type of format. But like as an industry, it is young. But there's also, I suppose, a different way of looking at it. If you look at it outside of industry, in terms of how people have dressed and how they've presented themselves, possibly for centuries. But then, I mean, we have the thing, like you were saying, it becomes ethnographic when you look at it up to a certain point.
Because certain cultures were photographed and represented in a very specific way with the intention for it to be othered.
Yeah. So
that becomes our kind of challenge, and maybe what I was more kind of speaking about in my previous statements is really that is trying to, our archives have a very set intention, and a lot of groups and demographics are excluded in their documentation or have very minimal documentation, also because of their lack of access to certain technology in order to represent.
I think that's your challenge in a way, which is exciting. You respond to the material that exists in a way that is distinctive and you feel true to yourselves. Yes. And the other side of it is that people actively start collecting clothes or documentation that you find interesting or representative or whatever remit fascinates you. And the beauty about dresses, we all wear it, we all respond to it in different ways. And in that sense, it's an incredibly inclusive and accessible media to engage with on any level. And that everyone has an opinion about it. So you can engage directly with communities, you can work with designers, or you can like represent the material that was collected in a very, very, rigid, with a very rigid and particular eye, is to subvert that and represent it with your eye.
So can I just interested in your curatorial decisions? If you can just speak us through the making of each of the pieces, the particular challenges, successes, and often in curating what you leave on the cutting floor to use that pun, says as much about the work as what's included. So if you can just speak to us about the making of these works and the individual curatorial approaches.
Well, in terms of how the films came to be, it was really about looking at the different perspectives, as I said, within fashion curation. So I invited curators who I believe have very distinct voices within this discipline. So Amy as an object-based fashion historian, Judith Clark as an exhibition maker, Walter van Berendonk as a fashion designer and curator, and Kart Debo, who is the museum director for MOMU in Antwerp, which is a museum which is focused on fashion and looks very much towards the avant-garde in the way that they present fashion and the designers that they present. So I gave each of these curators the same brief to look at modernity in 1914, and then worked with each curator in terms of having conversations about the filmmakers that they might be working with. In some cases, I was more involved in those conversations than in others. But the project itself was very much an experiment, and the way that I work and my practice, I've never worked within a museum context. I used to work for an organisation called the British Council, and I worked all around the world in countries as diverse as Italy to Nigeria, Yemen, Pakistan, and I always had to find a way of reaching audiences because I often wasn't working within traditional museum context. And so my practice has often been about commissioning new work and looking for new ways to reach audiences. So for me to want to work in film, I've been working in film for many years prior to this project, and was interested in how film can be used to democratize fashion, how it can be used to reach a wider audiences, and how curators can use this media to tell another story. So Judith, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time that I'd worked with a film, if you see what I mean. I mean, I'm used to staging exhibitions within galleries and museums. So it was an experiment, I think, for most of us, changing medium in a way that has facilitated conversations such as this one, which is amazing, that it's something that it's kind of, it shows a kind of working process that is very much kind of in infancy. We're not experienced kind of filmmakers in that sense, or script writers, or whatever, but it was about trying to figure out how one might articulate one's practice using 1914 as a kind of organizing date, partly because of the centenary and using those dates sometimes, you know, seemingly randomly, because of course they mean different things to different people. However organized our school syllabus might be, it still means different things to different families. So it's, in terms of our own legacy, we're working with a very personal idiom anyway. And Alison, I think, gave us the opportunity to kind of perform it, sometimes quite literally. I mean, I'm in the film, as you know, which again was very odd, you know, so it was very odd, kind of like, you know, creating a character that in a way is both yourself and not yourself. You know, you're a hypothetical figure, creating a story. Sorry, the sirens are on Oxford Street. You know, that is a figure that is a hypothetical figure in a way, even though I was performing that role. So there were lots of kind of stories within the films in terms of the reflection on our own practice. And I guess why I, in a way unusually, kind of agreed to be in the film was that there's something about being an exhibition maker that is quite literally about building something and about taking a reference and translating it. So the fact of my kind of looking at a book and then painting a prop was very important to me, because one of the things I wonder is the translatability of my references, which are very personal. That was one of my favorite books I was transposing from. So it was, you know, it was both generalized and personal at the same time. I don't know whether you had a similar experience.
It was a completely unique commission for me as well. I've never worked with film. I've always worked in 3 dimensions. So it was very thrilling. I did need help finding a filmmaker. I didn't want to work with a fashion filmmaker. And I suppose I had various, I mean, whatever we do in whatever context, we bring, as Judith says, we bring ourselves to the project, even if we don't consciously set out to do so. And for some time, I've been inspired by a particular phrase in a T.S. Eliot poem, which was about the Violet Hour. And it just appealed to me. And I kept thinking at some point I would do a project which evolves around the Violet Hour. And so then I started thinking as well about, I mean, I knew for me the starting point would be a garment, and it was what sort of garment. And I felt very strongly that there are fashions in, you know, academia and museology in the same way there are fashions in clothing. And in the last 10, 15 years, most curators and historians have been preoccupied with modernity. And I've become increasingly interested in the period just before modernity, so the 1890s, the 1900s and 1910s. So I thought I'm going to find an object, because I always start with something, on the cusp of modernity. And so I thought about a garment that is called a tea gown. And it was sort of anachronistic in many ways, because it seems like such a frivolous way of life that would ever wear a tea gown, but also in an era when fashion was incredibly restrictive, these garments were quite liberating. So it was simultaneously sort of historical and incredibly modern. And I'm also very, very interested in the sort of garments that don't normally get exhibited, exhibiting the unexhibitable, garments that sustain or perish. So I went to Brighton Museum, which is the museum where I've worked a lot, and I know the collection. And I went and looked particularly to see if they had a violet-coloured tea gown, which they did. And it was old and it was stained, and it was violet, which tied up with the Violet Hour. So that was my starting point. But from there, I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And Alison helped me find an animator. And I didn't really expect my film to be animated. But it was completely thrilling working with Katerina, and also seeing the process whereby she constructed an interior based on historical research. And I think the whole process about a collaboration is that you bring to the table what you can bring. And if you collaborate with someone wonderful, they always do something which exceeds anything you could ever have imagined. And I felt my experience of working with Katerina did just that. It was completely thrilling giving her a brief and then seeing what she did with it. So yeah, it was a completely thrilling experience for me.
How long did it take to get the pieces together? How long from being asked?
It's hard to kind of quantify, because I think all of us, we teach, we write, we do exhibitions. It wasn't, I mean, I think it was probably much more labour intensive for Alison. But I mean, in terms of my own time, I wouldn't think I spent more than 5 or 6 longish days. I didn't spend ages. But it's, it's half a day here, half a day there. But what I would say is it was over a period of months, and you're endlessly thinking about it. So the time you spend doing it might be a certain amount of time, but the hours of thought, I just don't know.
It's hard to quantify sometimes.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Do you want to introduce yourself, maybe?
Oh, I'm Michelle, and I'm an honors curatorship student. And I just wanted to find out, in terms of the politics of the representation of the body in the museum space, is it more acceptable exhibiting fashion on the human body on film or in digitized spaces, as opposed to exhibiting fashion using the real body in the museum space? Because I know in terms of curatorial practice, it's quite problematic to use the body or exhibiting the body in the museum space. So in the virtual space, is it more acceptable? Yeah, more acceptable.
Your voice broke up quick. Was the question the difference between exhibiting in virtual environments and gallery spaces?
Whether it's more acceptable on the virtual environment as opposed to the gallery environment. Yeah, with regards to representing the body.
With regards to
the body.
I think they're just different.
I mean, the body is the big taboo and the big question within fashion curation, of course. How could we get away from the body? And so, the first thing that happens when you accession an object, as you know as well as we do, is that it's no longer wearable. That's kind of rule, 101. No longer any contact or any prolonged contact with the kind of living body. And so it's always the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's what denies the garment life and is its reason for being. So it's always there. The thing about a digital project is that everything is hypothetical or whatever, virtual, whatever the word is. And so you can sort of, in a way, unite the garment with an imagined body in a different way, in a more seamless way. But whether you're getting around the actual problem, I don't know.
I think in terms of Carte Debo's film by Maurice Schuller, where you hear the model talking, I think the problem with the mannequin is that one never knows what it feels like to wear that garment. And with the digitally printed 3D dress, which Carte commissioned as part of her project, again, that was an experiment which went wrong. The material wasn't flexible. It was sharp. The model was actually in a lot of pain and they had to stop filming several times so that she could have respite from this dress. So I think, in terms of using the film in that instance for the model to talk about the experience of wearing the dress, enabled a conversation for the audience that a mannequin obviously doesn't allow.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about this experiment, is that it could engage with these things without, necessarily the object having to be a museum object, even though we always wonder about what it would feel like to wear these garments.
And there was an incredible immediacy with that, because that was never the intention of that film. And actually what was exciting was that the curator went with what happened, wasn't it? So it was never intended to be an exhibition about wearing a painful garment, because until it was made, no one knew it was going to be really painful.
And with Amy's dress as well, the dress has never been exhibited before, because of the fact that it's stained and it's fragile.
But it's also not incredibly special. It's one that wouldn't be selected. It wasn't, you know, the finest example in any sense. But its anonymity appealed to me, and you know, it's taking it a bit far, but you know, there's all the thing about the anonymous soldier, and you know, it's the anonymous garment. It's the garment that's hanging there without documentation, that was destined never to be seen. And I found that terribly appealing.
I think that's a wonderful connection to what, you know, what we have here in South Africa, where the stories of the ordinary, the banal, the stories that sit in the margins and the peripheries are often not told. And we're at this space in South Africa where we increasingly are looking to an archive of the ordinary, to find meaning in how we live. So your wonderful story about this dress that is tea-stained, that is not particularly spectacular, but which in turn is brought to life and animated and given a life, that we can start to
it's incredibly human, and it's poignant because of that. And I mean, I always argue that perhaps worn clothes more than any other media, they're the perfect media to tell stories with, of all sorts of lives, famous people's lives, but even more so because their lives are documented. It's all of our lives, because the clothes we wear go with us through our lives, and they're part of our lives. And so I think we can tell all sorts of stories about them. And I'm sorry I interrupted, but there's a time lag.
Oh no, same here. No, I was just saying it's a wonderful way to argue that something like 2015 or well 2014, that you are able to take an object that is innocuous and banal and stained and forgotten in many ways, and inscribe a set of stories and lives and bodies attached to that speak to who we are at this very moment, and argues, by making it an art object in one way, but also by animating it. I think there's something about that animation and representation of these lives that really goes beyond this as a curation in fashion. It speaks to us about, the onus on us, particularly in South Africa, to find those stories and those tea dresses, the equivalent tea dresses in post-apartheid South Africa, and inscribe these stories. So, that is what I take from your, from that tea dress from Brighton. So really,
and dressing. It's very broad field, and we engage with also, we might engage with the sort of the really luxurious couture dress that's never been worn, but that tells different stories. It can tell, you can make it the story of the grand woman who might have worn it, but you can also explore the life of the embroiderer or the person who even made, the press studs. Well, there wouldn't be press studs, but the hooks or the buttons. So I think it's what we bring as curators and what are our preoccupations. That depends upon the stories we tell as much as the object. And so I think we can tell magical stories about all sorts of objects. It's the angle we choose to take. And what the angle we choose to take is very much determined by the environment in which we work. And so Judith and I have both worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you tell very different stories at the Victoria and Albert Museum than you do perhaps at Brighton Museum, where I also work, which is a museum that's very much embedded in the community. You tell different stories because you're speaking to different people.
I think on that note, and also because our internet is going, I think we're tempting the internet gods by by trying to do this. So I know it's been awfully rude, but can we, on that wonderful note, I need to thank you for setting this up. It's a big deal for us, and I hope that this is just the beginning of lots of conversations and perhaps some collaborations down the line in the not too distant future, because I think we have lots to learn from each other, and I know our group of students here have enjoyed this. So from all of us in Cape Town, Nancy, thank you for setting this up. Thank you very much, and please come and visit us. And arguably one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Sheila. On behalf of all of us, we've really enjoyed it today. Okay. Okay.